With the Pima County Sheriff's Office in Tucson in the national spotlight these days as they continue searching for Nancy Guthrie, they're also responding to some discrepancies reported in the sheriff's own past work history.
The sheriff leading the investigation into Nancy Guthrie has just been exposed for something he kept hidden for more than 4 decades. Not a detail about the case itself, but something personal. Something from his past that raises serious questions about everything he has said and done during this investigation. Records that surfaced this week show he was pushed out of a previous police department under circumstances that were never publicly disclosed. When reporters confronted him about it, he didn't deny it. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he responded with just 6 words. And once you hear those 6 words, it becomes clear why confidence in this case may already be slipping. Before we get into what was uncovered, let's quickly reset where things stand, because you already know the basics. And there's no need to repeat everything that's been said for weeks. It has now been 39 days since Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman, vanished from her home in Tucson's Catalina foothills in the early hours of February 1st. Blood found on the porch was confirmed to be hers. The doorbell camera was physically disabled. Her pacemaker stopped transmitting data at 2:28 a.m. A masked individual was captured on footage carrying a backpack later identified as a Walmart model. Since then, investigators have reviewed thousands of hours of video, processed tens of thousands of tips, and issued major rewards, $1 million from the family and $100,000 from the FBI. And yet, after 39 days, no arrests have been made. No suspect has been publicly identified. No charges have been filed. So there is no indication that an arrest is imminent. Despite that, the man leading the local investigation, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, recently told NBC News that investigators are definitely closer.
So, Sheriff, it's been 30 days since Nancy Guthrie went missing. Are investigators any closer to finding the suspect or suspects?
I think the investigators are definitely closer.
Same phrase, every single week. We're closer. That's it. No timeline attached to it, no specifics, nothing you can actually measure, just closer. The wording doesn't change, the delivery doesn't change, and most importantly, the substance doesn't change. It sounds like an update without actually being one. And with that in mind, let me tell you what the Arizona Republic published this week, because once you understand what was in those records, the way you look at this entire investigation changes. The Republic didn't build this story on speculation. They didn't use anonymous sources. They didn't piece it together from internet theories or secondhand accounts. They obtained official documents, employment records, disciplinary records, verified material. And what those documents show is that Chris Nanos, the sheriff of Pima County, the man who has been the public face of this investigation since the very first day, was forced out of his previous law enforcement job. Not retired, not reassigned, not a voluntary departure. He was pushed out under circumstances he never disclosed at any point during his entire public career. And that omission didn't last a few years. It lasted over 4 decades. On paper, Nanos has a pretty straightforward law enforcement career. Years of service, worked his way up through the ranks, built credibility, ran for sheriff, and won. He became responsible for a department covering more than 9,000 square miles of southern Arizona. When a case of national significance lands in that jurisdiction, he becomes the spokesperson, the authority, the guy standing in front of cameras telling the public what's happening. But before Tucson, there was El Paso. In the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Chris Nanos worked as a police officer with the El Paso Police Department in Texas. That part isn't hidden. It's on his resume. It's been referenced publicly. It's been part of his professional identity throughout his career. What was never part of that record, what was never disclosed to anyone until now, is how that job actually ended. According to the documents the Republic obtained, Nanos did not leave El Paso PD under normal circumstances. He didn't complete his time there and move cleanly into the next chapter of his career. He resigned in lieu of termination. That phrase isn't casual language. In law enforcement, it carries a very specific meaning. It means the department had already made its decision. Termination was the intended outcome. So, the option to resign is not offered as a favor. It's a procedural step that keeps the word fired off the permanent record. The officer walks out, but the underlying documentation stays right where it is, inside the institution. The year the records show he left, 1982. The year listed on his resume, 1984. That is not a small discrepancy. That is a 2-year gap sitting in his official professional timeline, unchallenged and unexplained for more than 40 years. Now look at the disciplinary record itself, because this is where it stops looking like a single incident and starts looking like a pattern. This is not one mistake. It's not an isolated moment of poor judgment that you can chalk up to a bad day. It's a series of documented issues that together paint a very consistent picture. The records show findings of insubordination. Then that means refusing to follow orders from superiors. In a law enforcement structure that runs entirely on hierarchy and chain of command, that's not a minor thing. It directly affects whether someone can actually function within the system they're supposed to be part of. There's also a documented finding of excessive force. That matters not just because of the action itself, but because it represents a formal determination that the use of authority crossed a line. Separately from that, there's a firearm discharge incident recorded on its own, independent of the excessive force finding. Off-duty gambling shows up as its own disciplinary matter, serious enough to be formally documented. Repeated tardiness is in there too, not as a one-time thing, but flagged as a pattern significant enough to make it into the official record. And then there's the phrase that honestly carries more weight than any single incident: consistent inefficiency. That's not describing a moment. That's describing a pattern observed over time, across multiple evaluations, multiple reviews, leading to a formal written conclusion that performance problems were ongoing. The incident that appears to have pushed things to the breaking point. Nanos was suspended for 15 days without pay after allegedly injuring a robbery suspect during an arrest. A 15-day suspension without pay is not routine. That reflects a serious internal finding, and the case didn't just stay internal, it was presented to a grand jury. He was not indicted, but the fact that it got to that point tells you how serious the incident was considered to be. Across his entire time at El Paso PD, he accumulated a total of 37 days of suspension without pay. By 1982, the department had reached its decision, and that's when the resignation happened. Now here's the part that you sit with after all the individual details settle. Chris Nanos left El Paso Police Department in 1982. His resume said 1984. That is not a formatting issue. That is not a typo. That is not a transposed digit. That is 2 completely different years, 2 full years removed from when he actually left, sitting on his official resume unchallenged, unquestioned, and unexplained for more than 4 decades. Through his entire career in Arizona law enforcement, through every campaign he ran, through every public appearance, through every interview where his experience was held up as a qualification for the job he holds right now. That gap was just there. Nobody asked, or if they did, it never became public, until now. When the Arizona Republic went to him with the records, that was the moment where this could have been handled head on. He had real options. He could have acknowledged the discrepancy. He could have provided some context. He could have said this was early in his career. He moved past it. It doesn't define what came after. That's generally how public officials handle something like this when it surfaces. That's not what he did. His response was, "That's your urgent request? You sure you don't want to go back to my high school and ask why I got swats from the principal? Good luck with your hit piece." Think about what that response actually does and doesn't do. He did not deny the records. He did not explain the 2-year gap. And he did not address the discrepancy at all. He dismissed the entire thing and called official verified employment documents a hit piece. After that, the Pima County Sheriff's Department released a statement, not to dispute the records, not to say the Republic had anything wrong. Instead, they said the date discrepancies were the result of 2 clerical errors. They also acknowledged a second problem, a promotion date that had also been listed incorrectly on his resume. Both were quietly corrected after the newspaper found them. But here's the issue with calling it a clerical error. That explanation doesn't tell you how a clerical error survives 40 years. It doesn't explain why it was never caught or corrected during any of his campaigns, during background checks, during any moment of public scrutiny over 4 decades of public life. Now, it only got fixed after a reporter pulled the file. That's what clerical error is being asked to explain here, and it doesn't quite get there. And this is where it connects directly to the Guthrie investigation, because the same pattern that showed up in how the resume story was handled, minimize, deflect, correct quietly only after someone else finds it, that same pattern has shown up repeatedly throughout this case. Go back to the crime scene. Right after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, her home was a crime scene. There was blood on the porch, a disabled camera, personal belongings exactly where they were left. That scene needed to be completely secured. It wasn't. Reporters were able to get close enough to see the blood on the porch with their own eyes. When Nanos was asked about it, he acknowledged he would have handled it differently if he had another chance. That's a significant admission because crime scene security isn't an advanced technique. It's not something that requires specialized training beyond the basics. It is the first step. Before analysis, before interviews, before press briefings, you secure the scene. That didn't happen the way it should have. Then there's the optics issue that came up during the investigation. At one point, while the Guthrie family was making a public plea, speaking directly to the public and to whoever took Nancy, asking for information and help, Chris Nanos was at a college basketball game. Now in isolation, that can be explained. People have lives outside of work. City law enforcement leadership isn't expected to be physically present 24 hours a day at every moment of an investigation. But context matters here. The timing matters. And in a case where public trust is everything, that image, the family on camera begging for answers while the sheriff is at a game, added to a perception problem that was already growing. Then there's the forensic evidence. The DNA recovered from the scene involved complex mixed samples, multiple contributors, requiring sophisticated analysis. In cases like this, standard practice points toward the FBI lab at Quantico. That lab was built specifically for high-level complex investigations. It has direct access to federal databases. It has the specialized resources that exist for exactly this kind of situation. The evidence went to a private lab in Florida instead. Forensic experts publicly raised questions about that decision because when the best available resource is sitting there and it was designed for your exact situation, the expectation is that you use it. Then there's the sequence problem. Early in the investigation, Nanos publicly announced that the family had been cleared as suspects. That announcement came before the DNA results were finalized. In any investigation, the order matters. You collect, you process, then you reach conclusions. Here, the conclusion was announced publicly before the processing was done. The conclusion may have been right, but the order wasn't. And in a case this serious, process matters because it affects everything that follows. Then there's the accusation that was publicly reported that evidence may have been withheld from the FBI. Nanos denied it. There's no confirmed proof it happened, but the accusation exists, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands inside a broader pattern of decisions that already have questions attached to them, and that context changes how it registers. And then there's the internal voice. The president of the deputies union, someone whose job is to represent the officers working inside that department, described the handling of this case as a personal ego matter. That is not an outside critic. That is someone inside the system. At the same time, when outside organizations offered additional resources, drone teams, specialized search units, coordinated help, the sheriff declined. The union leadership publicly disagreed with that call and said more help should have been accepted. That's not just a difference of opinion between insiders and outsiders. That's a divide inside the department itself, playing out in public. And sitting on top of all of it is the same line at every briefing. We're closer. No details, no timeline, no measurable progress, just closer. So let's talk about where the case actually stands right now, because the resume story is not the investigation. It's the lens through which the investigation now has to be looked at. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. 39 days in, no arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed break in the case. What investigators have disclosed recently is that they are looking into a damaged utility box found near her home. That box may be connected to internet disruptions that multiple neighbors reported on the night of February 1st, outages to home surveillance systems that happened right during the window when Nancy was taken. If those outages weren't random, it means someone knew how to disrupt or disable the surveillance in that area and knew to do it before they made their move. On March 5th, investigators went door to door through the Catalina foothills asking two very specific questions. First, did you experience any internet disruptions on the night of February 1st? Second, did you have any video footage from January 11th? That second date is what stands out. January 11th is 3 weeks before the abduction. Investigators haven't publicly explained why that date is significant, but you don't ask residents for footage from a specific date without a reason. Something happened that day, or someone was seen, and investigators know it. There are witness accounts that support the idea that someone was in that area before the abduction. One neighbor described seeing a man in the neighborhood in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. He stood out immediately, not because he was doing anything overtly suspicious, but because he didn't fit. He was hunched over, moving slowly, looking at properties, and specifically looking at Nancy's home. In a neighborhood like that, people notice someone who doesn't belong. If that sighting connects to January 11th, it reinforces the picture of someone who was there to scout the area ahead of time. And when you look at everything else, that picture gets stronger. The doorbell camera was disabled before they entered. They showed up at a time when Nancy would be alone. They came during hours when a response would be slowest. They may have knocked out the surrounding surveillance systems. None of that is impulsive behavior. That is someone who thought this through and planned it out. Now here's where the evidence actually sits. Tips to the FBI tip line came in heavily at first, but have slowed down significantly. The reward is over $1 million combined and hasn't produced a break. DNA recovered from the scene has not matched anything in CODIS. Gloves found nearby were traced back to someone with no connection to the case. The vehicle spotted on camera around 2:36 in the morning still hasn't been identified. The firearm holster has not led to a suspect. The Walmart backpack has not been traced to a buyer. Every major piece of physical evidence and every major lead is still open. None of them have gone anywhere. And this is where time becomes a real factor. The first 72 hours after an abduction are when investigators have their best shot. Evidence is at its freshest. Witness memory is at its sharpest. The scene is still as intact as it's going to be. What happens or doesn't happen in that window shapes everything that comes after. If that window isn't fully used, the investigation doesn't get a reset. It continues, but it continues from a weaker starting point. You don't get those hours back. So when you step back and look at the full picture, it is not one issue. It's an unsecured crime scene. It's a private lab chosen over federal resources. It's a public clearance announced before the evidence supported it. It's conflicting communication throughout. It's internal criticism from people who work inside the department. It's an unresolved public accusation about evidence handling. And now it's a 40-year-old forced departure from a prior department that was never disclosed to anyone and only came to light because a newspaper pulled the records. Any one of those things on its own can be explained. Together, they form a pattern, and that pattern is hard to ignore. Now to be clear about what this does and does not mean. None of this means Chris Nanos had anything to do with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. None of it means the investigation is entirely compromised or beyond recovery. There are federal agents, forensic analysts, and investigators working this case whose work doesn't show up in press briefings and whose efforts are real. That matters. But leadership still matters too, because leadership drives decisions. And the decisions made at the top of an investigation shape what the investigation actually looks like and where it ends up. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She needs daily medication. She has been missing for 39 days. Her family has held it together through all of this. They've cooperated fully. They've offered over $1 million in reward money. They've kept showing up publicly and privately, doing everything they can to help find her. They deserve clarity. They deserve transparency. They deserve to have confidence that the process working to bring her home is being run the right way. And that keeps bringing everything back to the same question. A question that nobody in a position of authority has actually answered. Given everything that has come out, both about how this investigation has been handled and about the background of the person running it, is the right person in charge? Every day that passes without an arrest makes that question harder to set aside. Every lead that stays open adds to it. Every inconsistency makes it more difficult to dismiss. And at some point, that question stops being rhetorical. It gets answered, either by results showing up or by the continued absence of them.